Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to have a look at one of the more popular exam questions that appears certainly in the Unit 2 Edexcel paper, and that is evaluate the view that the Prime Minister dominates the Cabinet. What we want to do is we want to look at the 3 paragraph themes we're going to take, we're going to look at the examples we're going to use, we'll then think about what the analysis will look like, and then we're going to try and make an evaluation at the end of each paragraph as to which is the strongest of the 2 sides of the argument. Hopefully, if we get over time, what we're going to try and do at the end as well is to have a look and do some practice writing, show what an example of paragraph might look like, and then hopefully give you some time to practice yourself. So in this essay, the very first point I'm going to make is about the power of patronage. So you know, hopefully from your Prime Ministerial unit, the Prime Minister has the power of patronage. And what that means is they can appoint whomever they want to the Cabinet. Now, it's very likely that the Prime Minister will therefore choose allies, friends, and those of a like mind, politically speaking. So a really good example of this was the Cabinet of Boris Johnson. Now, Johnson chose figures who posed very little threat to him as Prime Minister and who he could easily dominate. You know, he chose ministers such as Nadine Dorries and Jacob Rees-Mogg, who were essentially signed up members of the Boris Johnson fan club. Now, why this is important is this enabled Johnson to dominate policy making, as nobody around the Cabinet could give any opposition to his proposals. Now, the power of patronage also extends to firing Cabinet members. Again, Johnson displayed the full use of this patronage when he fired his Sajid Javid and replaced him with Rishi Sunak in January 2020. Now, Javid had been opposed to the spending plans being put forward by Johnson, and therefore his firing demonstrated that Prime Minister is in almost complete control of the Cabinet and will therefore dominate policy making. So when Javid tries to say, no, I don't think you should do that, Prime Minister, the Prime Minister says, well, I want to do this, I don't think we can continue working together, and he moves him on at that point. However, and here's the analysis here, some Prime Ministers will find that they don't have complete control over patronage. Now, often forming a cabinet becomes an exercise in kind of party management. A Prime Minister will need to ensure that they have key members of their party, particularly those who represent a certain wing of the party, within the cabinet. Now, a really good example of that was, again, 2022, when Rishi Sunak had to reappoint Suella Braverman as his Home Secretary. And that was because she represented the influential European Research Group faction within the Conservative Party. This was an even more serious problem for Theresa May. She's the Prime Minister between 2016 and 2019. Now, May had to walk a really fine line to include both Brexiteers and Remainers within her cabinet. This is a real problem, particularly for Prime Ministers who have a small majority. And for these Prime Ministers, they need to ensure that they get the support of differing factions within their party so that they can get key pieces of legislation passed. Now, another factor might be that they need to include big beasts within the party. So again, Theresa May is a classic example of this. She originally excluded Michael Gove from her cabinet in 2016, but soon enough she had to bring him back when it became apparent that he was causing problems for her on the back benches. Gove being this kind of influential figure who younger MPs or other backbench MPs kind of would gather around, it kind of made him too much of a dangerous figure for her, and to keep him quiet she had to bring him back into the cabinet. So this shows you that Prime Ministers don't always have complete control over patronage. So what we've done so far is we've looked at the original point, which is that a Prime Minister can dominate the cabinet because they have full control over patronage. We've then kind of looked at the analysis and said, yeah, but however, not all Prime Ministers have full control of their patronage. Sometimes, and particularly Prime Ministers with a small majority, have to do an exercise in party management and bring in people they otherwise wouldn't really want in their cabinet into the cabinet. So what we want to do here is evaluate those 2 arguments. As I say to my students, you're really thinking, well, which of these 2 is the strongest argument, which is more likely to occur. And I think the evaluation here is quite straightforward. Our electoral system usually means that Prime Ministers are given massive majorities. So obviously, just recently, Keir Starmer won a majority of 174. Back in 2019, Boris Johnson had a majority of 80. So it's actually really rare for a Prime Minister to have a small majority. And the Prime Ministers with small or no majorities, such as Cameron and May, are actually anomalies in our system. And even again, if you look at, say, someone like Rishi Sunak, who had to include MPs he did not like or did not trust in his cabinet. This was a really unusual situation in which his Conservative Party, they've had 3 prime ministers in the space of a few months. The party has become kind of fractious and there's a lot of infighting going on. So he's having to bring in these figures from different wings of the party. Therefore, the strongest argument has to be, in my mind, that the prime ministers can dominate the cabinet, selecting whomever they please. Okay, so a second point on whether or not the prime minister dominates the cabinet, to me, would be about policy making and the idea of where is policy made. Is the policy made in cabinet or is it made by the prime minister themselves? Once again, I think the answer is pretty clear that the prime minister absolutely dominates policy making. So by and large, the prime ministers dominate all policy making, and it's become increasingly the case that prime minister will kind of formulate policy with the help of a very small group of political advisors, and that's been true of many of the most recent prime ministers. Tony Blair, who was prime minister between 1997 and 2007, he exercised what was often termed kind of sofa politics, where he was determined policy himself and with a group of small advisors, and then he relayed that information to the Secretary of State, who'd be expected to defend the policy on a one-on-one basis rather than allow the cabinet to discuss that policy. David Cameron, who was prime minister between 2010 and 2016, he used what was called the Quad, which is a group of 4 senior ministers, to determine the majority of policy. Whilst Boris Johnson left almost all of his policy decisions to his chief of staff, Dominic Cummings. So what you can see here really is that in an ideal scenario, in the original idea of cabinet government, policies would be thrashed out between a group of these 22 to 24 ministers. That's just not the case any longer. Essentially, the prime minister with a small group of advisors makes the policy. They then present it to the cabinet, and the cabinet has to, they can voice some objection, but more or less they really have to do what the prime minister is telling them to do. Now, on the other hand, so on the flip of that, some cabinet members can exercise power over policy making. This can be quite dependent on their own relationship with the prime minister or on the prime minister themselves. And some prime ministers are a bit more hands-off, a bit more laid back, and they want to give a bit more kind of leeway to ministers to take their own decisions. Now, the example I'd like to use here would be of Gordon Brown, who was Chancellor to Tony Blair for 10 years between 1997 and 2007. Now, Blair gave Gordon Brown an almost total control over government spending, and that meant in turn that he had a huge amount of control over the direction of government policy. Even if you look in very recent times, Rachel Reeves, I'm talking here at the back end of July 2024, and just this week, Rachel Reeves as Chancellor has said, we are going to give pay rises to public sector workers. We are going to have to find savings in transport, for example. So here what you've got actually a really powerful cabinet member who's essentially making decisions and saying to the prime minister, well, we don't have money to do that, or we do have the money to do that. Health Secretary, here you can give 22% pay rise to junior doctors. So what you do see is that individual cabinet members do have some power, particularly if you are the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The other point to make about this was that sometimes prime ministers are actually just a bit more kind of laid back, and they say, well, we're going to give an opportunity to a forward-thinking minister to come up with their own policy, and I'm just going to let them do what they want because I'm not really interested in that area. And I think here a good example would be the approach taken by David Cameron, and particularly in education. He said to his Education Secretary, Michael Gove, do what you want, Michael, and I'll just sign it off. So there are these occasions when particularly the Chancellor, but other ministers can have a lot more control over policy than we'd otherwise expect. And the Prime Minister doesn't always completely dominate policy making. But if we now go back to this idea about the evaluation, which of these two scenarios is more likely? And once again, you'd have to say that it is so much more likely that the Prime Minister will dominate policy making. The example we'd given of Blair and Brown, that was owing to a very set of particular circumstances that existed between Blair and Brown over how they took the leadership, or how Blair was given the leadership and Brown stood aside, and there was this kind of weird personal animosity between the two men. And Blair himself says, he felt guilty, which is kind of why he gave Brown so much more kind of space to make the policy that he wanted. So, once again, by and large, prime ministers will always choose to take control over policy. And quite frankly, the only time they ever choose to use ministers is usually to give them or afford them some of the blame for any failures that take place, and they take most of the credit. Okay, so let's come on to the final point now, and what I want to do is give a kind of a different take now. So I want to look at ways in which maybe the cabinet actually does have a degree of power over the prime minister. And the point I want to make here is that the cabinet can remove the prime minister in exceptional circumstances. So let's go back to front really here. Remember the relationship between the prime minister and cabinet, and that's that the prime minister is primus inter pares, which means they are the first amongst equals. They have not been elected, so we're talking about the prime minister here. The prime minister has not been elected on their, on a special mandate. They're not like the American president, and they've been elected as a constituency MP, and then they have been chosen by their party to lead the party. So the cabinet can remove the prime minister. This was most famously the case first off with Boris Johnson very recently in 2022, and then also with Margaret Thatcher in 1990. Now, Johnson was forced to resign as Prime Minister in 2022 after 64 of his ministers resigned. All these ministers were stating that they no longer had confidence in his ability to lead. Now, at that point, with so many key figures within the cabinet saying that they did not believe that he could lead, his position becomes untenable. He can't reasonably hope to govern the country if so many of his own closest ministers say this guy is unfit to govern. Now, the same was true with Margaret Thatcher also. So she's the Prime Minister between 1979 and 1990. Now, her cabinet withdrew their support for her. She called this treachery with a smile on its face. But treachery or no treachery, Thatcher did have to resign once it became clear that she had lost the support of her cabinet. So now what we're going to do is think about the kind of analysis that we're going to do here. And I think the point to make is that despite the examples we've given of Boris Johnson and Margaret Thatcher, it's really incredibly rare for a Prime Minister's cabinet to withdraw their support. And this is particularly the case because most of the time, as we said in paragraph 1, the Prime Minister usually fills their cabinet with friends and allies, and the cabinet is often their strongest supporters. Now, in fact, if you look at both, say, Theresa May and Liz Truss, they're both prime ministers who had cabinet members who wavered in their support, but ultimately it was the backbench MPs within the Conservative Party who drew their support rather than the ministers themselves. It would be pretty foolish for some of these cabinet members to withdraw their support for the prime minister because they owe the prime minister that very job. And if the prime minister goes, they probably go as well. And with it, they lose an additional salary, they lose their, all the trappings of being a government minister. So really, none of them want to kind of withdraw the support for the prime minister unless it's in a very, very exceptional circumstance. Okay, so in the evaluation section here again, and this should be pretty straightforward, I would say that on balance, it's really unlikely that the cabinet will withdraw their support for the prime minister. If nothing else, most ministers do not want to lose, their highly prized jobs, and they know that enforcing the resignation of a sitting prime minister, a prime minister who's given them their jobs, that might be too big of a risk to take. Since 1945, only 2 of the 16 prime ministers have actually been removed by the cabinet. So firstly, Margaret Thatcher, and then Boris Johnson. We've seen so many of those prime ministers. We've seen where the cabinet members have clearly been frustrated by the prime minister. Some individual ministers have considered removing them, but rarely has a cabinet collectively come together to remove a prime minister. Most decide that actually it's better for them to allow the prime minister to take their own decision themselves. So whilst they do have this power to force the prime minister to resign, they really don't take it very often. Okay, so in summary, here are the 3 points I've made. In blue, you can see. So, paragraph number one that I'd like to make is that the Prime Ministers have these patronage powers. They can appoint whom they want to the cabinet, and that gives them complete and almost total control over anything that happens, and those ministers are very, very loyal to them. The second point we made, which is that the Prime Minister dominates policy making, and the third point is that, ultimately the cabinet could remove the Prime Minister, and I put it in italics there because they could remove the Prime Minister, but it's really, really unlikely. The green box you can see at the top here is essentially my argument, and I don't think there really even needs to be any middle ground here. By and large, the Prime Minister will almost absolutely always dominate the cabinet. And I think, put your neck on the line here. Don't sit on the fence. It's really good for you to have a strong argument. Be clear that nearly always the Prime Minister will dominate the cabinet. That's most often because the Prime Minister, or our electoral system, gives the Prime Minister massive majorities, and that really gives them their own personal mandate sometimes, but it also just gives them a lot of power to dominate policy making, to decide who's going to be in the cabinet, and therefore it is very, very rare that the cabinet can exercise much more power than you'd imagine.